In the long reign of a single queen, Victorian inventions changed the world. Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837. By the time she died in 1901, the modern world had been formed.
It was a time of outstanding engineering, remarkable innovation, all of it driven by ambitious pioneers. It shaped the world we live in today.
Efficient and fast new transport systems allowed people to move freely for the first time.
You get a real sense in here of Victorian engineering.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful.
Giant feats of ingenuity saved lives.
The Victorians had ambition, they thought big, and they got on with it.
Amazing inventions revolutionized our domestic lives.
What I'm holding in my hand changed our homes forever.
Automation transformed mass production. Factories could now produce goods at a rate never imagined before.
The change is like a nuclear weapon going off.
This is the story of how the Victorians built Britain.
This time, I learn how cotton changed the world.
We were in a society where you could look as you wanted.
Discover how the fearless team of engineers and industrialists brought the sea to landlocked Manchester.
There are those that think that the Manchester Ship Canal is the finest feat of engineering of the entire Victorian era.
And kicked off the great rivalry between Manchester and Liverpool.
Was all Manchester thumbing its nose at Liverpool?
In short, yes.
At the start of Queen Victoria's reign, the nation she inherited stood on the brink of a revolution that would transform Britain and the world. It was a revolution built on machines and on a new idea called mass manufacture. The Victorians invented the concept of the factory, making goods on an industrial scale and selling them across the globe. It would make Victorian Britain the richest nation the world had ever seen.
At the forefront of this technological revolution was one city in particular, Manchester.
These new mills and factories in Manchester were built for one simple commodity that almost everybody in the world wanted and soon needed: cotton. The mass manufacture of cotton cloth would change Victorian Manchester and would change the world.
In the early 18th century, Manchester was a small market town of around 10,000 people, and it was surrounded by rolling hills and farmland. By the end of the Victorian age, it was a sprawling metropolis, home to over 900,000 people and England's second biggest city. It was packed full of dark, satanic mills, churning out cotton by the millions of square meters. The export of this cotton would help make Britain the greatest trading nation in the world. When Victoria came to the throne, Manchester was already a successful cotton town, thanks to local engineer James Hargreaves, who invented the spinning jenny. Cotton cloth is created from raw cotton bolls, and Manchester received a third of its supply from America's southern plantations. The initial cargo was shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to the port of Liverpool, emptied at the docks, and carried by horse and cart to landlocked Manchester 36 miles away. The final leg of the journey took 12 hours and needed an expensive change of horses. To reach its full potential, Manchester's cotton trade needed a new method of transport to cut the journey time from Liverpool to its cotton mills. Fortunately for the Victorians, the railway was now coming of age. I've come to the East Lancashire Railway to discover how an engineer called George Stephenson used the latest Victorian technology to bridge the gap between Liverpool and Manchester and become known as the father of the railways. Few know more about Stephenson than Erin Beeston, the curator of Manchester's Museum of Science and Industry.
George Stephenson was a pioneer of the railways, and he engineered the line between Liverpool and Manchester, and he was brought on board just to create the railway itself rather than the locomotives that would run on it.
How did they decide what kind of pulling power they'd have?
Well, they had a competition the year before the railway opened in 1829, and one of the locomotives to run was designed by George Stephenson's son, Robert, and that was the famous Rocket locomotive. They were looking for a few different things, and Rocket was by far the fastest and most reliable, and I think it hit a speed of about 30 miles per hour.
Stephenson's Rocket was the first steam locomotive to bring together several innovations to produce the most advanced engine of its day. The Rocket was so successful, it became the template for steam locomotives of the future and caused a stir when it was first unveiled.
The opening ceremony itself was a complete spectacle. All of the MPs, important, notable, famous people of the time wanted to ride at the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway.
We tend to focus on the passengers on the railway, but is that where an economist would regard the significance of this first intercity railway?
Initially, the idea was really to get goods quicker from the port of Liverpool, things like raw cotton, materials that needed to be brought into Manchester and then redistributed amongst the Lancashire cotton industry to be produced and made into products that could then go back out to the Empire.
Cotton could now be transported from Liverpool docks to Manchester in just 2 hours, knocking an astonishing 10 hours off the old journey time.
It's remarkable to think that it was cotton, humble cotton, that spurred those great northern cities, Manchester and Liverpool, to build the world's first intercity railway. And as the new railways started to crisscross the country, they transformed Victorian Britain, slashing travel times. In fact, more than that, opening up a whole new world of travel for rich and poor alike.
When the Liverpool to Manchester railway line opened in 1830, it was the culmination of a mammoth construction project. The 36 miles between Manchester and Liverpool were crisscrossed with rivers, canals and swamps. Huge feats of engineering were needed to conquer an unforgiving route. The Manchester to Liverpool railway was the first to tunnel beneath a city, the first to have signals, first to have a timetable, the first to carry mail. But that wasn't all. It also had to transport all that cotton to and from Manchester's factories and mills. Manchester was booming. A new revolution in manufacture was about to make it explode.
Here we have a Lancashire loom, the workhorse of the Lancashire cotton industry.
But while the mill owners were drowning in money, the workers weren't so lucky.
The conditions for the new workers were grim. Many were dying before they even reached their 20s.
Could Manchester change its ways and get the royal seal of approval?
This was a major event for Manchester.
At the very beginning of the Victorian era, Manchester was on the way to becoming the centre of the world's cotton trade. Thousands of tons of raw cotton flowed into the city through the port of Liverpool and along the new Manchester to Liverpool railway. If Manchester's mill owners wanted to keep growing, they needed a new generation of machines to take productivity to the next level. I've come to Queen Street Mill in Bury, just 8 miles outside Manchester.
One of the very few cotton mills left where you can see surviving examples of the inventions that revolutionised Victorian industry and made this whole area a powerhouse of mass manufacture.
There we go. Right.
Curator Philip Butler has fired up the steam engine for me, so I can see one of the last working Lancashire looms in existence, running in all its glory. It's the machine that made Manchester the king of cotton.
You can barely hear yourself think.
Imagine how much noise 900 made. Here we have a Lancashire loom running, as you can see, from a belt from the line shafting overhead. The Lancashire loom was made in Burnley and was the staple, was the workhorse of the Lancashire cotton industry in terms of weaving.
The revolutionary Lancashire loom was invented by James Buller and William Kenworthy in 1842. Instead of needing a factory full of people working one person and one machine, the Lancashire loom meant one 15-year-old could operate 8 machines at the same time. As soon as the new looms came online, productivity went through the roof. A mill like Queen Street was now 8 times more efficient. It was a remarkable transformation.
How did machines like this change the cotton industry?
Once cotton could be woven fast on power looms like these, then goods could suddenly be exported around the world. And Lancashire actually became an exporter of cotton goods to places like India, which was a complete reversal from the century before.
Thanks to cotton, Manchester was now in the driving seat of the mass manufacturing revolution. By 1871, almost a third of global cotton production came from this small area of Britain. At its peak, the Lancashire cotton industry had over 250,000 powered looms.
OK, steer clear of it.
This kind of Victorian innovation came with great rewards, and no one man made more money than the inventor of the Lancashire loom, James Buller, the first cotton millionaire and the Bill Gates of Lancashire. In just over a decade, he went from being a humble engineer to part of the landed gentry. His family's wealth was staggering, and in the course of Victoria's reign, the Bullers would build vast mansions, buy their own Scottish islands, and commission luxuries like a 221-foot steam yacht named Rumour. But not everyone was as lucky as the fabulously rich Buller family. The mill workers lived a grim life. A typical working week would be 14 hours a day for 6 days a week. And most workers were expected to clean their machines during meal times.
What sort of people were the people who worked here?
You would get all working age members of the family working here in the mill, from young apprentices and both the female and the male members of the family.
And in Victorian times, children?
There were children here between 9 and 13, certainly.
Was it dangerous as well?
It could be. They were building large, heavy cast iron machines, and that entailed rotating wheels and cogs and fast-moving belts, and everything was a danger of being caught or trapped, so it could be very hazardous.
This could be dangerous work. Health and safety simply didn't exist then, and terrible injuries were common. The mills relied on child labour. 200,000 children worked in Manchester's cotton industry. They were paid a fraction of what adults earned and were punished far harder. A child worker would be beaten or fined for falling asleep, making a mistake, or being late. As Manchester's boom continued, the welfare of its workers could no longer be ignored.
The conditions for the new workers were grim. Many were dying before they even reached their 20s. The suffering was bad for them, but bad for the mill owners too, who saw the productivity of their factories being held back by illness, injury and death. So, philanthropy and self-interest. The civic leaders came up with a novel idea for improving their workers' health and quality of life.
Manchester had grown so fast, it now had its own separate borough, Salford, home to thousands of mill workers. And this is Peel Park, the pride of Salford. It may not look that remarkable today, but almost 2 centuries ago, this was so cutting edge, people could hardly believe it was real. Welcome to one of Britain's first free public parks. Within a decade, it was being copied all over the country and then the world.
Peel Park opened in 1846. It was, in the words of the time, for the enjoyment and recreation of the public without charge or restriction. A revolutionary Victorian concept. It was paid for by local cotton industrialists, by dignitaries like Sir Robert Peel himself, and from contributions from working people in the area.
Peel Park is a fitting tribute to one of Lancashire's finest sons, Sir Robert Peel. Born in nearby Bury, he founded the Conservative Party, went on to become Prime Minister twice, and most famously of all, created the modern police force, known then as Peelers. Unlike other parks, Peel Park was free and had no restrictive dress codes. It was a place for workers and bosses alike. Just on the edge of the park came another Victorian first.
Creating the first public park wasn't enough for the cotton elite. In their urge to educate the working class, they set up a new kind of library. It was to be the first unconditionally free public library in Britain, maybe the world.
It's now a gallery and houses a remarkable collection of paintings, one of which documents a milestone in the city's history, a visit by Queen Victoria in 1851. This was the first time a ruling monarch had visited the area in over 150 years. I'm here to meet the gallery's heritage manager, Kerry Horrocks, to discover how Her Majesty's visit, officially to open the park and library, went down with the locals.
This was a major event to mark the Queen's visit to Salford and Manchester. So Salford decided to gather 82,000 school children in the park to sing for her on her arrival. So this is in 1851, and she arrived from Worsley New Hall, where she'd been staying, with great pomp and ceremony for this wonderful reception.
And there are 82,000 young children there?
Absolutely. They had to be over the age of 8, and they came from Sunday schools from throughout the area, not just Salford. Each school was given a marshal, a route they had to come by, a time they had to leave. It was all very, very precise. And the benches that had been built for them were apparently allocated with 21 inches of bench per child.
And how did the visit proceed?
So they left around 10 o'clock. The route was lined by lots of cheering crowds, but also by an ingenious human telegraph, which was a way to make sure the children sang at exactly the right moment. So gentlemen in top hats lined the route, and when the first carriage passed them, they waved their top hat in the road, and then the next one, all the way along the line, last hat was waved, and apparently they all started singing perfectly. They did only manage one verse of the national anthem. They just started cheering afterwards.
Why was it so significant?
I think it was a recognition for Salford and for Manchester and for the region of just how important they'd become as centres of generating wealth, generating a lot of income, and the industry that was being developed. Salford itself was the seat of many innovations in the Industrial Revolution.
Queen Victoria's visit really was a royal stamp of approval for the pioneering plan to improve the health and condition of the local people with a groundbreaking new kind of library and park. But most of all, the Queen was recognising that it was northern cities like Salford and Manchester that were helping to make her kingdom the richest the world had ever known. And it was all on the back of businesses like cotton.
Landlocked Manchester was set on even greater domination. They now wanted a port of their own to cut out their greedy neighbour, Liverpool.
Mancunians thought that the Liverpool merchants were extracting too much money from them.
To become masters of their own fate, they built one of the wonders of the modern world.
There are those that think that the Manchester Ship Canal is the finest feat of engineering of the entire Victorian era. In 1861, cotton was king and Manchester was making the cloth that dressed the world. Great fortunes were being made and ordinary families were being dragged out of rural poverty into the towns and cities.
Manchester imported 3/4 of its cotton from American southern plantations, where it was hand-picked by slaves.
Then disaster, civil war in America, pitting the Northern Union against the Southern Confederacy. The Union President Abraham Lincoln called on the mills and factories of Europe to stop using slave-picked cotton from the Southern Confederate states.
At great personal cost, Lancashire mill workers sided with President Lincoln and refused to touch American cotton that had been picked by slaves. A year into the Civil War, the effects of the cotton embargo began to bite. 60% of Lancashire's looms lay idle, leaving tens of thousands out of work. Yet still, the Lancashire workers refused to use American slave-picked cotton.
With the cotton industry on its knees, President Abraham Lincoln acknowledged the self-sacrifice of the working men of Manchester in a letter he sent them in 1863. He praised them for helping to end slavery in America with what he described as a selfless act of sublime Christian heroism that has not been surpassed in any age or any country.
The end of the American Civil War in 1865 allowed Manchester's mill owners to concentrate on making money again. They identified a problem closer to home that was damaging their bottom line. Their noisy neighbours, Liverpool. What Manchester did next started one of the most bitter and famous feuds the world has ever known. Nowadays, most people think Liverpool and Manchester hate each other because of football. But they'd be wrong. The real reason is cotton. Manchester resented paying what they thought were excessive charges to Liverpool merchants to use their docks and railway line. They calculated that as much as 60% of their profits were taken in overinflated charges by their Liverpool neighbours. The only way Manchester could become independent was by cutting Liverpool out of the cotton equation. To do this, they'd build the largest ship canal the world had ever seen. In 1882, the idea of the Manchester Ship Canal was championed by Manchester manufacturer Daniel Adamson, and the man he trusted to make it happen was civil engineer Edward Williams. Their plan was for their cargo ships to sail past Liverpool docks and head to Eastham on the Mersey estuary. From here, the brand new canal would head northeast for 33 miles, passing Frodsham to Runcorn until it reaches Barton. Here, the ship canal would somehow have to cross the smaller but still important Bridgewater Canal. Finally, ships would sail the remaining 3 miles to the brand new port of Manchester with its 9 docks. The world had never seen anything like it. Historian Liz McIver is a recognised expert on the ship canal and understands how it kick-started the feud between Liverpool and Manchester.
The rivalry goes back quite a long way, and in the 1700s, really, Liverpool had the upper hand over Manchester because it was where the gentlemen merchants were. It was where all the money was being made, all the transactions, because, of course, it was a port, and that was how all the raw material that Manchester might use would come in. So once Manchester started to grow in terms of large factories and manufacture, there became almost a rivalry of class.
So what did they decide to do?
Well, they broke one monopoly by essentially creating another and building the ship canal and building a port and docks.
Give me some sense of the scale and ambition of a project like this in the 19th century.
The ship canal's been described by historians certainly as, if you like, the greatest feat of engineering in Victorian Britain. It was creating a man-made waterway where none existed and creating an inland port, something that just couldn't have existed naturally without a massive engineering project that would involve not only huge amounts of workers, but mechanical machinery for the first time.
The building of the Manchester Ship Canal was a massive engineering endeavour, the likes of which had never been attempted before.
Every great project has to start somewhere, and the first shovels hit the earth here on the banks of the Mersey at Eastham. If the canal was to be a success, they were going to have to build a channel big enough to carry ocean-going ships 36 miles all the way to landlocked Manchester. The first big engineering challenge was to separate the canal from the tidal waters of the Mersey estuary. And to do that, the engineers came up with the Eastham Locks, still the biggest in the United Kingdom.
The entrance to the Manchester Ship Canal is through these huge gates. They weigh 300 tons each and are built of Demerara greenheart wood, which is more durable than iron and less liable to damage if hit by a ship. When Edward Williams designed the Ship Canal, he had to deal with the problem that geographically, Manchester is 60 feet above sea level. So when a ship enters at Eastham Locks, it's lifted 55 feet up, so it can make the journey safely to Manchester. Edward Williams' plan was to dredge a channel between a set of retaining walls. It was back-breaking work. A team of around 12,000 Irish navvies dug the canal almost entirely by hand. To enable ocean-going cargo ships to sail directly to Manchester, the channel had to be 120 feet wide and 28 feet deep for the entire 36 miles. For those watching its progress, it became known as the Big Ditch. By the time the canal was finished, the navvies had excavated around 40 million cubic meters of rock and earth. For the first 2 years, construction went according to plan. But then Edward Williams died suddenly, and the project began to unravel. The Big Ditch was scheduled for completion by 1891. But a terrible winter that year was the final straw, and the company formed to build the canal ran out of money. It looked as if it might never be finished. Almost bankrupt, the Ship Canal Company went cap in hand to Manchester Council and was bailed out to the tune of £3 million. That's £250 million in today's money. The build was back on. But before the canal could be completed, there was one giant engineering problem to overcome.
There are those that think that the Manchester Ship Canal is the finest feat of engineering of the entire Victorian era. If they're right, then this is the best of the best. It's an aqueduct that carries an older canal over the Ship Canal. And the astonishing thing is, it opens, water and all, to let the big ships through.
When the swing aqueduct is in this position, it's linking both sides of the much smaller Bridgewater Canal. It's now safe for barges to sail across the aqueduct, which holds 800 tons of water. But when an ocean-going ship sails along the Manchester Ship Canal, then the aqueduct swings 90 degrees into the middle of the canal to allow the larger vessels through. Sounds complicated, but it's really, quite simply, marvellous. The Grade 2 listed swing aqueduct opened in 1894 and remains in regular use.
It's not only the first swinging aqueduct in the world, it's the only one. True testimony to the ingenuity of the Victorian engineers of Manchester. They solved a seemingly insoluble problem, and they built it so well, it's still in use well over a century later.
After 6 long, hard and expensive years, the people of Manchester had fought to build their ship canal. And finally, on the 1st of January 1894, it was opened. total cost was over £15 million. And it made Manchester Britain's third busiest port, despite the city being 36 miles from the sea. Mancunians thought their future looked secure. Now they had a direct link to the rest of the world and could finally bypass Liverpool docks.
When it opened, was there a big fanfare?
There was a huge party, great decoration, bands, lots and lots of well-dressed people, huge crowds of ordinary people as well, partly here to see Queen Victoria, who opened the Ship Canal officially.
And was all Manchester thumbing its nose at Liverpool?
In short, yes. At the beginning, when the Ship Canal had first opened, a lot of people who hadn't believed it could happen were suddenly full of the joys of spring at the fact that they had this fantastic engineering project that was going to employ so many people.
Liverpool didn't take Manchester's challenge to its supremacy lying down. As soon as the Ship Canal opened, many Manchester traders, in an act of regional treachery, snubbed it, because Liverpool docks and the railway line dropped their prices drastically to stop the canal becoming a success.
The Manchester Ship Canal was only in commercial operation for around 80 years, so you could see it as maybe it wasn't that successful. But if you look around now, this area has been redeveloped and the Ship Canal is potentially going to be used in the future in different ways.
When you look at the Ship Canal now, what does it tell you about the Victorians?
When I see it, I think of tenacity, I think of forward planning, future thinking, being able to think about more than just the 10 years in which it'll make a difference to you and your business. These are people who plan for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren's prosperity, and that's something that's quite hard to think about these days.
Manchester was now making more cotton than the world had ever known. Then along came the final piece in the cotton puzzle: the sewing machine.
The change is like a nuclear weapon going off.
And it was going to change shopping forever.
Everything was on a bigger scale than anyone had ever seen before.
Manchester's mills had made the laborious process of turning cotton into cloth a fast and highly efficient process. Now, the economic impact of cotton started to ripple through society, from rich to poor, affecting everyone's life. Manchester's cotton revolution was about to spark a change in the way we dressed and how we shopped.
The next step was to move down the process and do the same thing for the mass manufacture of clothing. In 1850, a simple dress shirt had to be sewn by hand, 14 hours or more of painstaking labour. The pace of life was quickening up. Those thrusting Victorians wanted something far faster than that.
I'm meeting Alex Askarov, an expert on the invention that would change the way we dressed forever: the sewing machine.
Before the sewing machine, since humans started to wear clothes, they had to hand stitch everything. And they would actually get 2 pieces of fabric, animal skin or whatever, and they would do this laborious stitching, one after another. And you would spend all day doing this.
Along comes the sewing machine. How great is the change?
The change is like a nuclear weapon going off.
All of a sudden, you've got a piece of mechanised, mass-produced machinery that takes this job and just turns it into this job. And it makes it so easy. It's astonishing. You know, I'm not skilled at this. This is what's doing it all.
It's not just a brilliant machine, it's a thing of beauty as well, isn't it?
Oh, next door, if you want to see beautiful machines, let's go and have a look.
OK, lead on. My goodness.
Yeah. It's just crammed with them.
Hundreds of them. Who invented the sewing machine?
The first known invention, 1790, British Thomas Saint. He put plans in at the Patent Office for a leather working type machine.
It took 60 years of refining Thomas Saint's original idea before the American Singer Company produced a mass-manufactured sewing machine in 1851. In 1868, they turned to Britain once again to build the world's biggest factory. Glasgow was selected for its iron-making industries, cheap labour, and because Singer's general manager, George Mackenzie, was of Scottish descent. With nearly 1 million square feet of space and almost 7,000 employees, it was possible to produce 13,000 machines a week. Over the next 60 years, Glasgow produced over 36 million machines, selling them all over the world. Everyone could now get in on the cotton revolution, and it changed the way we dressed.
People just looked better. Everybody just looked better. They made their clothes, they altered their clothes. We were in a society where you could look as you wanted, and that is an extraordinary thing.
Before the Victorian era, shopping wasn't the fun pastime it is today. Shops were austere places, small, dark, poorly ventilated. All the goods were kept in drawers or cupboards or under the counter. Absolutely no browsing.
If you wanted to touch or even see the goods, you needed permission from the shop's clerk. Most goods didn't have prices on them. One had to ask how much it cost, and then the haggling began. But haggling was a little too common for the new Victorian middle class. They wanted a better way to spend their money. Changes were afoot.
This is the Burnington Arcade in London's Piccadilly, perhaps the United Kingdom's first shopping mall. It's a pedestrianised collection of small shops under a single roof to protect the customers from rain. And to this day, it's still patrolled by the Burnington Arcade Beadles, who still wear their traditional uniforms, including top hats and frock coats. Morning.
Good morning.
Historian Michael Patterson has studied how the Victorians' love for retail changed the way we shopped forever.
So there were several things that created the consumer climate of Victorians. There was more disposable income than there had ever been. Secondly, goods were manufactured more cheaply. Thirdly, stuff was much better displayed. The Victorians had plate glass and they had gas lighting. The result was that window shopping became a widespread activity. You could have a lot of fun just browsing the windows. The shops themselves then became bigger because everything the Victorians did was on a bigger scale than anyone had ever seen before.
During the Victorian period, a new addition to the high street was about to transform the simple shopping arcade into something recognisable the world over. The son of an East End grocer decided to move the family firm up west and expand the operation to start selling medicines, perfumes, stationery, food, and off-the-peg clothing. His name was Charles Digby Harrod, and he gave us one of the first department stores.
What would Charles Digby Harrod think about our shops today?
The notion of a shop that is the size of a cathedral or a railway terminus had never been seen before. That was a Victorian innovation. If a Victorian in a time machine came here, they would recognise the names of half a dozen stores that are still trading. And here are some actual receipts from the 1890s. William Whiteley, John Lewis, D.H. Evans. We all know those names because they're still in business. It's a fantastic commercial legacy.
As the Victorian consumer revolution gathered pace, new department stores opened up and down the country, catering to the demand for new clothes and anything else you could think of. 100 years on, cotton had all but gone from Manchester, and its last mills closed. However, the story of Manchester and cotton still lives on. I've come to Tower Mill, a Victorian mill building in the city centre. to find out more about a new cotton revolution built on Victorian foundations. General Manager Andy Ogden has created a state-of-the-art factory inside a Grade 2 listed Victorian mill.
We're the UK's only cotton spinning facility. Started 2 years ago, very new enterprise.
And what's your point of difference?
Well, we're the highest quality spinner in the world. So we're taking the best of the raw materials from California, spinning it into superfine yarn for the really high-end luxury markets and the manufacturers that are still left in the UK.
What does cotton mean to you?
It's one of the most important things in my life. I'm from this community. When I grew up, there was 1,000 mills in my area. To come back and actually bring back the original manufacturing process, I'm very proud of that.
Extraordinary that Manchester, which once produced 90% of the world's cotton, should have lost it all. And heartwarming in a way that cotton should be back. Perhaps the spirit of those Victorian innovators is still around here and being tapped into by a new breed of mill owner.
The Manchester of today has been profoundly shaped by its Victorian cotton past. Everywhere you look in the city, you can see the legacy of cotton. From huge mills like this, to the Manchester Ship Canal, and the grand civic buildings which were paid for by the money made from cotton.
The Victorian age was a period of profound change. Almost every aspect of people's lives was transformed during the 64 years of the Queen's reign. And cotton was a key driver of that change.
It helped build the railways which connected every corner of the country.
And it built the huge factories that changed the way we lived and the way we worked.
The cotton industry also had some surprising and unexpected consequences. It led to the creation of free public parks and libraries. It changed the way we dressed and turned us into a nation of shoppers.
Each and every Victorian, from the humble factory worker to the greatest industrialist and engineer, all played their part in forging the modern world we live in today.
Without the Victorians, the Britain we know and love would not exist.